At 40, life doesn't usually fall apart all at once. It stays standing. From the outside, it even looks stable. You wake up around the same time every morning. You know the shape of your days. You know which light turns green first on your way to work, which coffee tastes familiar, which conversations require effort and which ones don't. Nothing feels new, but nothing feels broken either. And that's what makes it hard to explain. Because when people ask how you're doing, there's no obvious answer. You're not in crisis. You're not celebrating either. So you say the safe words. I'm fine. Busy. Can't complain. And technically, all of that is true. At 40, life often looks exactly like the version you once hoped for, just without the feeling you expected to have when you got here. You have responsibilities now, real ones. People depend on you in quiet ways that don't announce themselves. Bills get paid. Plans get made weeks in advance. You think about health more than you used to, even if you don't talk about it. You think about time, how fast it moves, how little of it feels like your own. There's a strange pressure at this age, not the loud kind, the silent kind, the kind that says you should already know who you are by now, the kind that makes you hesitate before admitting confusion, because confusion feels inappropriate at 40. But it's there. It shows up late at night, when the house is quiet and your phone finally stops lighting up. It shows up when you catch your reflection in a window instead of a mirror and don't immediately recognize the person looking back. Not because you dislike them, but because they feel unfamiliar. You remember being younger and thinking 40 would come with clarity. You imagined confidence would settle in naturally, like something automatic. You believed that by this age, the big questions would be answered. Instead, they've just changed shape. You don't ask, what do I want to be anymore? You ask, is this really how I want to live the next 20 years? That question doesn't come with panic. It comes quietly. It sits with you during normal moments, while folding laundry, while driving home, while watching something you've already seen before, because choosing something new feels like work. At 40, you've learned how to function even when something inside feels unresolved. You've learned how to smile through meetings, how to listen without interrupting, how to keep things moving. You've become good at being reliable, and reliability earns respect. But it also hides a lot. Sometimes you wonder when exactly you became this tired. Not physically tired, though that happens too, but mentally tired. The kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix, the kind that comes from holding yourself together for a long time. There's a subtle grief at this age, not for something that happened, but for something that quietly didn't. Paths you didn't take, versions of yourself that never fully formed, dreams that didn't fail, they just faded. You don't talk about those much. They sound ungrateful if spoken out loud, and you are grateful. That's part of the conflict. You know many people would want what you have, so you feel guilty even noticing what's missing. At 40, gratitude and dissatisfaction can exist in the same space, and that's confusing. You start measuring life differently now, not by excitement, but by endurance, by how long you can keep doing this, by how sustainable your days feel. You don't crave chaos or reinvention. You just want something to feel lighter. Sometimes you replay old moments in your head, not the dramatic ones, the small ones, times when you laughed without checking the time, when you made choices without calculating consequences, when you felt like life was expanding instead of narrowing. You tell yourself that's just nostalgia, that everyone feels that way, that this is adulthood. But still, something doesn't fully settle. At 40, you notice how often conversations stay on the surface. People talk about work, schedules, responsibilities. Everyone sounds busy. Everyone sounds tired. And no one really asks the deeper questions because no one wants to open a door they're not sure how to close. So you keep your inner thoughts quiet. You start realizing that being put together doesn't mean being fulfilled. It just means you've learned how to manage. You've learned how to show up, And while that's admirable, it doesn't always feel alive. There's a moment that happens sometimes, maybe in the car, maybe in the shower, where you suddenly feel the weight of time. Not fear, awareness. The understanding that more years are behind you now than ahead of you. And that realization doesn't come with urgency. It comes with stillness. You wonder if you're using your time well, not productively, meaningfully. At 40, you don't want more things. You want more alignment. You want your outer life to match your inner one a little better. You want your days to feel intentional instead of automatic. But knowing that doesn't instantly change anything. You still wake up. You still go where you're expected to go. You still do what needs to be done. Life keeps moving, whether clarity arrives or not. And maybe that's the hardest part. There's no clear signal telling you something is wrong, no breaking point, just a quiet sense that something is unfinished, something unnamed. You're not unhappy, but you're not fully at peace either. At 40, you start understanding that life doesn't pause for self-discovery. It keeps going. You have to figure things out while everything else continues. And sometimes, late at night, you ask yourself a question you don't answer right away. Is this enough? Not for others. For you. At 40, you don't wake up one morning and suddenly feel different. Change doesn't announce itself anymore. It slips in quietly, over years, through repetition. You start noticing how often your days resemble each other, not in a dramatic way, just enough to blur the edges. Weeks pass faster now. Months feel lighter, almost thin. You remember when time used to feel heavy, full, like something you could stretch. Now it moves with its own rhythm, indifferent to your plans. You begin to understand that life didn't slow down because you got busier. It sped up because you stopped marking moments. At 40, you've already lived through enough cycles to recognize patterns. You've seen excitement turn into obligation. You've seen motivation fade into maintenance. You've watched people change, not suddenly, but gradually, until one day you realize you don't speak the same language anymore. Some relationships didn't end with conflict. They just grew quiet. Messages stopped coming. Invitations became rare. You told yourself it was normal, that people move on, that everyone is busy. And that was true. But it still left a space. You think back to choices you made that once felt right. You don't regret them exactly. Regret is too sharp a word. It's more like curiosity now, wondering how different things might have felt if you'd chosen another path. Not better, just different. At 40, you understand that every decision costs something, even the right ones. You chose stability, and it gave you safety, but it also narrowed your options. You chose responsibility, and it gave you purpose, but it also took spontaneity with it. You chose commitment, and it gave you connection, but it also required sacrifice. No one explained that part when you were younger. They talked about success, not trade-offs. You've learned that exhaustion doesn't always come from doing too much. Sometimes it comes from doing the same things for too long without asking why. There are moments now when you feel strangely detached from your own life. You go through the motions, handle what needs handling, say the right things, and from the outside, everything looks consistent. Inside, though, something feels worn down, not broken, just thin. You start noticing how much energy it takes to stay exactly where you are. Maintaining a life requires constant effort. The routines, the expectations, the version of yourself people recognize. You didn't realize how much of your identity was built on momentum until you felt it slowing. At 40, you don't collapse, you carry on. But carrying on feels heavier than it used to. You think about the people you've lost, not only to death, but to time. Friends who drifted, versions of family that no longer exist, younger selves who believed things would eventually make sense on their own.
Sometimes you miss the certainty more than the people. You remember how confident you once were about the future, how clear it seemed. You had timelines, milestones, a sense that life moved forward in a straight line. Now you know better. Life loops, it pauses, it revisits old questions with new context. And at 40, you start seeing that many of the answers you were chasing don't arrive as conclusions, they arrive as adjustments. You become more aware of your limits, not just physical ones, though those make themselves known too, emotional limits, mental limits, the understanding that you can't be everything to everyone without losing something of yourself. This realization doesn't feel empowering at first. It feels like loss. You start saying no more often, not out of confidence, but out of necessity. You realize that your energy isn't unlimited and you can't afford to spend it carelessly anymore. You become selective, not because you're wiser, but because you're tired. At 40, tiredness becomes informative. You notice how certain things that once mattered deeply no longer hold the same weight. Arguments you used to rehearse in your head now feel unnecessary. Approval you once chased feels less urgent. Success, as defined by others, loses some of its shine. But nothing rushes in to replace those things. There's a quiet emptiness that follows letting go, a neutral space. And that space can feel uncomfortable if you're not used to it. You might mistake it for failure or boredom or stagnation. In reality, it's transition. You begin reflecting more, not in a dramatic, life-changing way, just small moments of honesty with yourself. You catch yourself thinking, I can't keep living like this forever. And for the first time, you don't mean it as a complaint. You mean it as a fact. You notice how often you've postponed things, rest, joy, change, waiting for the right time. And at 40, you realize that the right time rarely announces itself. It just becomes later. This awareness doesn't lead to sudden action. It leads to caution. You start asking different questions, not what should I do next, but what actually matters now. You recognize how much of your life has been shaped by expectations you didn't choose, cultural ones, familial ones, silent ones you absorbed without realizing. And while you don't reject them outright, you start examining them more closely. Do they still fit? Do they still serve you? You feel a subtle shift inside, not confidence yet, not peace, just honesty. At 40, honesty feels like progress. You begin to accept that some doors are closed for good, not in a tragic way, just realistically. Certain versions of life belong to the past now, and while that realization carries sadness, it also brings clarity. You don't have to keep imagining every possibility anymore. You can focus on the ones that remain. You start understanding that meaning doesn't come from adding more. It comes from choosing carefully, from removing what drains you, from simplifying where you can. This doesn't make life easier overnight, but it makes it more intentional. You still have days when everything feels heavy, when fatigue returns, when doubt creeps back in. But something has changed in how you relate to those feelings. You don't panic as quickly. You don't assume something is wrong with you. You recognize these feelings as part of the process. At 40, you stop expecting life to resolve itself. You start realizing that resolution is something you participate in. You're not fully there yet. You don't have all the answers, but you're no longer waiting for clarity to arrive from the outside. You're starting to listen inward, and that's new. The questions you ask yourself now feel quieter, but more serious. They don't demand immediate action. They invite reflection. They ask for patience. You sense that something is shifting, not dramatically, not visibly, but steadily. The weight is still there. The responsibilities remain. The uncertainty hasn't disappeared. But underneath it all, there's the beginning of something else. Not hope exactly, not relief, just understanding. And for the first time in a long while, that feels like enough to keep going.
It comes when you stop arguing with reality. You still wake up early, your responsibilities haven't disappeared, your life hasn't suddenly become lighter or simpler. But something inside has shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way others would notice, just enough for you to feel it. You no longer expect life to feel exciting all the time. You don't interpret quiet as failure anymore. You've learned that peace rarely announces itself. It settles in when you stop demanding more than the moment can give. At 40, you begin to understand that most of your suffering didn't come from hardship alone. It came from resistance, from wishing things were different instead of learning how to live with how they are. This realization isn't comforting at first. It feels like surrender, like letting go of the fight you've been holding on to for years. But over time, you notice how much energy that fight was costing you. You start choosing where to place your attention more carefully. You no longer give the same weight to every thought that passes through your mind. You've seen enough cycles now to know that not every feeling requires action. Some just require space. You notice how your definition of success has quietly changed. It's no longer about proving something to others or to yourself. It's about sustainability, about whether a life can be lived without constant tension. At 40, you stop chasing intensity. You start valuing steadiness. You find yourself appreciating small, ordinary moments in ways you didn't before, not because they're magical, but because they're real. A quiet morning, a familiar street, a conversation that doesn't drain you. These moments don't promise anything. They simply exist. And that feels enough. You stopped waiting for permission to feel content. There's a certain humility that comes with this age. You realize how little control you actually have, how many outcomes were shaped by timing, by other people, by circumstances you couldn't influence. And instead of feeling defeated by that, you feel lighter. You don't have to carry everything anymore. You begin to forgive yourself more easily, not for big mistakes, those took time, but for the smaller ones, the times you didn't know better, the choices you made with the information you had then. You stop replaying old scenes in your head, trying to rewrite them. You accept that some lessons only arrive after the moment has passed. At 40, you understand that growth isn't about becoming someone new. It's about shedding what no longer fits. You let go of the pressure to constantly improve yourself. You're not against growth, but you no longer believe that you're fundamentally unfinished. You see yourself as a person in motion, not a project to be fixed. This changes how you move through the world. You listen more than you speak. You don't rush to explain yourself. You're comfortable leaving some things unsaid. Silence no longer feels like something to fill. It feels like space to breathe. You notice how your relationships change as well. You don't need as many. You don't tolerate as much noise. You value honesty over harmony, but you deliver it gently. You've learned that connection doesn't require constant closeness. It requires mutual respect. Some people drift further away, and you let them. Not with bitterness, with understanding. You know now that not every relationship is meant to last forever. Some are meant to shape you, then release you. At 40, endings feel less like failures and more like conclusions. You've also made peace with your limitations. You know what drains you. You know what restores you. You don't apologize for needing rest. You don't measure your worth by productivity anymore. You understand that being busy isn't the same as being meaningful. This doesn't mean life becomes easy. There are still hard days, still moments of doubt, still times when the old questions resurface. But you meet them differently now. You don't panic. You don't spiral. You trust yourself to navigate discomfort. At 40, trust replaces urgency. You no longer feel the need to rush toward the next phase of life. You're aware of time, but you're not racing it.
You're present enough to notice where you are. And where you are is imperfect, but real. You've learned that clarity doesn't come from overthinking. It comes from paying attention, from noticing what consistently brings a sense of alignment and what consistently pulls you away from yourself. You don't ignore discomfort anymore, but you don't dramatize it either. You treat it as information. This is the quiet wisdom that arrives with age. You stop looking for life lessons in dramatic moments. You find them in repetition, in what stays, in what returns, in what no longer bothers you the way it used to. At 40, you begin to see your life not as a series of achievements, but as a relationship with yourself. And like any relationship, it improves with patience, honesty, and forgiveness. You no longer expect answers to be permanent. You're comfortable with evolving understanding. You know that what feels right now may change later, and that's not a betrayal, it's growth. You've stopped asking life to make sense all at once. You've learned how to live inside uncertainty without needing to escape it. There's a calm strength in that. Not loud, not visible, but steady. You walk through your days with less resistance. You accept that some things won't change, and instead of fighting that, you focus on how you show up within those boundaries. You choose presence over perfection. At 40, you realize that meaning isn't something you find, it's something you create through attention, through intention, through how you treat your time, your energy, and the people around you. You don't need a dramatic purpose. You need consistency. You need honesty. You need space to be yourself without performing. And maybe the most important thing you've learned by now is this: life doesn't need to feel extraordinary to be worthwhile. It just needs to feel true. So you keep going, not because everything is resolved, but because you've learned how to carry what isn't. You move forward without demanding certainty. You allow life to unfold without trying to control every outcome. At 40, you finally understand that peace isn't the absence of struggle. It's the absence of resistance to who you are. And that understanding stays with you, quietly, steadily, enough.